So in the security section, we can ensure that our switch aligns with the security policy of the IT department. And so one of the things that is important is to make sure that we have a minimum and maximum password length that matches. And so we would change that here. The user accounts that we created when at the initial switch setup show here. So that user is our admin user with the 15 level privilege at the highest. And the user that we created in the quick start is that user 1, which we set at 9. So if we look at privileges, we can take a deeper dive into what that actually means. And so we can see in each group name, you can assign a value, and that value will allow that user to read and write when logged in based on the value privilege level that you give them. And then connections, so you want to minimize attack surfaces as much as you want, or as much as you possibly can. In order to do that, you're going to go to the console, and so you may want to have no access whatsoever. So you could enable that through the software. You could also say that you don't want to enable Telnet. You want to maybe you want local access for SSH and local access for HTTP, or maybe even Radius. And so if you were using Radius, you could also use a secondary in case the Radius server was not available. So you could do local as a fallback and click save if you wanted to use that. The user lockout feature is another important feature. And so what this is going to allow you to do is set parameters around how many times someone can attempt to log in and what happens after that. So that's a feature that's enabled by default. So there's 50 violations, and then the failure resets after 15 minutes, and then the duration for that lockout is 30 minutes. You can change that. And then you can see if if someone has been locked out, it would show up down here in the log below.
So if you click on the Radius tab and then under Config, here you can globally set the timer settings for the Radius service. Under the Servers tab, this is where you will define and point to your Radius server or servers. To add a Radius server, you would click on the Add button, enter in the IP address of the Radius server, and enter the Radius ports used. Keep in mind, the most commonly used default standard ports are UDP ports 1812 for authentication and 1813 for accounting. There are other ports that can be used, but these are the most common. If you leave the timeout and retransmit fields blank, it will use the timers defined under the Config tab. But if you have multiple servers with different timer settings, you can choose to change them for the appropriate servers. You can do the same with the secret key. You can also define a global secret key for all servers in the Config tab. Under the 802.1x Ports tab, then under Ports below, and then finally under the Admin State dropdown. The first two are very common port configurations. First, we have Force Authorized. This is when you do not want to apply 802.1x on a particular port. This would usually be the case when you are connecting to another device inside your network, such as another switch or a router, or even a device that does not support 802.1x. Then we have Force Unauthorized. This is when the connection is not authorized until a successful authentication exchange has been completed through the Radius server. Then, under the Config tab, this is where you would globally enable the 802.1x configuration, and also you can edit various related settings depending on your Radius server guidelines. So moving on, under the Port Security tab and under Ports below, we can define how we want port security to operate on the ports. So for example, if we enable port security on port 8, we can limit how many hosts, or more specifically, how many MAC addresses that are allowed to access through this port. So if we leave this setting at 4, that means if there are 4 MAC addresses coming in on this port, and then 5 or more MAC addresses want to gain access, then any MAC address learned after the initial 4 will be dropped without any negotiation of any kind. So that's just a hard stop number. Now, under the mode dropdown, we have 3 violation mode types. We have Protect, which means when a violation occurs, the port will allow permitted MAC addresses to gain access to the port and drop MAC addresses that are not permitted. But in this mode, when a violation occurs, the port itself will not shut down and no log or SNMP notifications will be sent. Now, when the port is set to Restrict, it will act the same way as Protect. However, it will send a log or SNMP notification. Now, when the port is set to Shutdown, when a violation occurs, it will send the log or SNMP notification, but it will also administratively disable the port. Then you would have to manually re-enable the port after a violation occurs. You would re-enable the port under the Ports and VLANs tab. So the Port Security Sticky Mode is a great way to apply apply permitted MAC addresses without having to manually enter them all in. So when you enable the sticky MAC setting, the port will dynamically store all of the incoming MAC addresses, but not hard code them until you apply the desired MAC address into the config. Under status, you can see the sticky learn MAC addresses after they've been entered in. And under MAC addresses, this is where you can manually enter in the port security MAC addresses.